Привет! And this is just to show that this is not an anti-Russian session, please. It's about discussing about Kremlin, Putin, and so on.
Хорошо.
So, да.
Давай.
Нормальный. Right, in a way, it could be called the cherry on top of the ice cream of this conference, because many of us are Kremlin watchers, Russia geeks, whatever you call them, but people who really spend their working time and sometimes even their free time on looking at what's happening in Russia and between Russia and the West. So, this is going to be extremely short. I see we've got 44 minutes left, so please be aware of this, dear friends, and I will introduce my panelists right now. Thomas Hendrick Ilvest, former president of Estonia, and of course, a prominent representative of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, in earlier times. And we've got Vladimir Kara-Murza here, member of the Russian opposition and former chairman of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation. We've got Daria Kalinyuk from Ukraine, the co-founder and executive director of the Anti-Corruption Action Center. And last but not least, Michał Kobosko, who's the chairman of Polska 2050, a newly founded political party and the former head of the Atlantic Council Office in Warsaw. So great to have you here. I would like to shoot 3 questions to you. For each question I would ask you to very briefly respond, and then there will be follow-ups, and then there will be an exchange with the actual audience right here and the virtual audience out there. So let me begin with a question that could actually be answered with one word. Will there be an improvement of relations between Russia and the West as long as Putin is in the Kremlin?
No.
Thomas Ilves. Very good. Daria.
Well, Vladimir Putin told democracy is obsolete. If the West agrees with that, it could be improved. I hope the West will not agree. And that makes me to respond the same as Mr. President did.
Volodya.
I was teaching my kids the definition of a rhetorical question. The question doesn't require an answer. I think it's one of those, obviously not. And I think the central point, which I hope we get to discuss more during this conversation, is that in Russia, and this goes for centuries of our history, not just recent years, domestic and foreign policy are always 2 sides of the same coin. And when Russia is democratic domestically, we see this reflected in a much more progressive pro-European foreign policy. And when we have a regime that represses the rights of its own people and breaks our own laws, there's no reason to expect it to behave as a responsible member of the international community. So, of course, no, and I hope we get to discuss this in more depth as this conversation goes on.
But here's a narrative out among both think tankers and politicians in the West in general, also in the European Union, some of its new member states too, that Russia cannot build a democratic a polity because Russians are somehow genetically incapable of doing so. How would you answer this as a Russian?
Well, this is one of the oldest, one of the most insulting, and one of the most factually baseless stereotypes that we have heard throughout history. Ronald Reagan, in his famous Westminster speech in 1982, when he spoke about this idea that somehow that there are nations and cultures that are just incapable of living under a rule of law democratic system, called this idea cultural condescension or worse. And I often repeat that phrase of President Reagan's because that's exactly what it is. It's been said about many countries in Europe, in the world, that they are somehow incapable or unable or unwilling and whatever, and all of these today are functioning democracies. There's absolutely no reason why every other country in Europe can be a functioning democracy, and just 2 countries, Russia and Belarus, cannot. It is obviously has nothing to do with reality, and again, happy to elaborate more as we continue this dialogue.
Thomas Ilves,
very briefly. I mean, we heard the same kind of nonsense argument from Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, as well as sort of various Chinese ideologues about the Confucian way of doing things. Human rights are not important, individual is not important, And then you go to Taiwan, which is no less Confucian, which is one of the most thriving liberal democracies I've been to, where freedom of speech, human rights are respected above all else. I think it is a nonsense argument, and to accept it is racism.
Exactly. Michał Kobosko, any improvement visible as long as Putin is in the Kremlin?
You wanted a short answer.
Yes.
Well, the shortest one would be no.
Right.
The longer version would be we will see.
Excellent.
We will see, because I'm not speaking precisely about Russia. I'm speaking about the world. In this world of today, you have to expect the unexpected, and this is the reality. We don't know what might happen next week. We don't know what might happen next month. Even things that we are taking for sure, that we are taking for granted, are changing. So we'll see what's going to happen. Nobody was expecting the collapse of the Soviet Union. Come on, nobody.
Indeed.
Literally nobody. Then it happened. So I try to be slightly optimistic.
Let me just throw in this a follow-up question to this, to whomever it may concern here. There is a set of questions about what comes after Putin. Will it be better? Will it be worse? Can it be possibly better or worse? How would you answer this question? What comes after Putin must or should or will be better or worse?
If it's Patrushev, it'll be worse. If the entire regime is swept out, it can be much better. And I would just quickly say here, do not talk about the Putin administration, please. That is not an administration, it is a regime.
Yeah, absolutely. Kay, let's move to the next question I prepared. And this is Macron's proposal, repeatedly put out, but also shared by other people in Europe and even some people in Washington. And that is, let us engage Russia, let us therefore now engage Putin as a potential a counterweight to China. Because the Russians and Chinese, this whole cooperation at the moment is very superficial. They actually hate each other's guts. And if we just give Putin a little bit, I wonder what we should give him, of course. But this narrative is out there. How
Eastern
would you
Europe,
respond to this?
Of course.
Yeah, sphere of influence, yes, all these things. But we cannot give that.
What is that a little bit? A little bit of Ukraine, a little bit of Belarus? That's the question. I think already a lot was given to Putin. And in terms of Ukrainians, these are 14,000 people who died. And Putin is challenging international order. So it's already enough. There has to be a very sharp response from the West. And to my opinion, I believe that democratization in Russia is possible. I believe that we have to be ready for that change. But I also believe that we can speed up democratization in Russia if the West will also change. Because if the relationships between Russia and the EU are bad, actually Russian elites are very well integrated already to the West. And this is what the President told yesterday at his speech when he was given an award to Alexei Navalny. You know, they have passports of the EU, they have free access to their capital, to the EU, to the US, to the UK, but still, the EU is treating Russia as a threat, but is not threatening corruption, which is empowering Kremlin as a security threat. So that is my concern. I wish the EU could change and accept that corruption is actually the security threat for the EU, UK, and the entire West liberal democracy idea.
Vladimir.
I have to say, in the early years of Putin's rule, it was exasperating for us as Russian Democrats to see so many Western leaders and Western elites talk about potential cooperation, let's extend a hand. And I came to work with Boris Nemtsov about the same time as Putin came to power, the very late 1990s, beginning of 2000s, and we saw the signs straight away. We saw the restoration of the Stalinist national anthem. We saw the closure of independent media outlets. We saw the beginning of the falsifications of elections, the process, of course, that is now complete. And all this while, you know, we saw Western leaders give a red carpet treatment to Vladimir Putin, and it was exasperating, it was enraging. But frankly, to to hear the same now, after more than 2 decades that Putin's been in power, it's bordering on ridiculous and absurd. I mean, like a few weeks ago, there was an article in Politico, a Washington newspaper, dedicated to the fact that the current US administration has used the Magnitsky Act, the law on targeted sanctions against those very kleptocrats and oligarchs that we were discussing, that they've used them against so many countries, from Nicaragua to Ukraine, all over the world. But they haven't used them against the regime against which it was intended in the first place, against the regime of Vladimir Putin and his close circle of kleptocrats and Kremlin wallets. And that article in Politico quoted an unnamed White House official saying that the reason for this non-implementation of the Magnitsky Act is because the US administration wants, and I quote almost exactly, wants to give Putin more time to prove if he can be a constructive partner. How much more time do you need than 22 years? After annexations, after wars, after hundreds of political prisoners, after the leader of the Russian opposition was assassinated in front of the Kremlin, what else do you need to see if Putin can quote-unquote prove? And again, it's no longer enraging or exasperating, it's just ridiculous and absurd, and I just wish that unnamed White House official does not represent the actual policy line of the US administration.
Yes, let me stick to the Biden question, because there I think the jury is out, and the expert community and media cover a wide spectrum in judging exactly this stable confrontation that Joe Biden wanted to introduce with Vladimir Putin before and during and after the meeting with him. So let me ask Thomas Ilvest, I mean, where on a scale of 1 to 10, where does Biden range in terms of effectiveness to deal with Putin?
Well, an article appeared about an hour and a half ago from Washington Post saying that despite President Biden's request, there has been no decrease in cyber attacks from Russia against the United States since they met, to which I immediately thought of, I'm like, why not? And I said, then people in the United States, and I would say Western Europe, have not read their Lenin, who said, when you probe with a bayonet, if you hit mush, keep pushing. If you hit steel, pull back. And that is the essence of the problem, is that they keep hitting mush. And the mush is the West. It's mush in the brain, not thinking. And this perpetual hope, hope springs eternal, said Alexander Pope, and the rest of us all say hope dies last. Well, in any case, we tend to bear the brunt of these things.
Great one-liners from you here. Michał Kobosko, what's your verdict on Biden and Putin?
Well, I understand your very initial question was about kind of driving a wedge between Russia and China, because whenever you are hearing Trump or you are hearing Biden, you are hearing China, 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 China. Yeah, that's the American reality. What's our reality? I do not believe when I'm listening to Macron and also some American politicians talking about this kind of wedge. I do not see this as a very realistic scenario in today's reality. China and Russia, they do have some things in common. They share some values, if you call them values. One thing that is common for both of them is kind of a definitely adversarial posture towards the West, and specifically the US. And both the Chinese and the Russian regimes, they hate American military power, obviously, the constant promotion of democracy and democratic values. Obviously, China is the industrial superhouse, and Russia is about natural resources, so they do share some economic interests, and they are kind of combining their best assets. Therefore, they have a lot of things in common, and also what they have is it's a borderline as long as 4,000 kilometers between Russia and China. Russia obviously wants to have this border pretty safe on their side, and to be ready to focus solely and exclusively on the border with the NATO allies. Therefore, it's in I believe in Russia, today's in Russia regime, strategic interest to keep this alliance with China as a strategic one, and all these talks about the wedge that we would love to see doesn't seem very realistic today.
Great answer. Let me just come back to this, to the Biden thing. How spontaneously? How do you judge? I mean, is Biden seriously changing the approach that we got used to over the last 5 years with the Trump administration? Is there a strategic shift in the relationship with Russia, or, as some Europeans would say, we get more of the same?
Well, I think we started with some hopes for the new thinking, new strategic decisions from the new U.S. administration. But I must say that from today's perspective, early October 2021, we don't see much change, actually. So the short answer would be no, it's a bit more of the same that we saw under Trump.
Thomas.
Well, what we see in the United States is we shouldn't really focus on Russia in this case. It is simply there's a realization now on the part of the Biden administration that their primary adversary is China. As a result, certain things follow. Clearly, MENA, the Middle East and Northern Africa, is something they do not want to deal with and would prefer Europe deals with it. Europe hasn't really woken up to that. And Russia is the unknown here. We don't know what their attitude toward Russia is. I mean, Biden in the past, we had no illusions, but the point is that they're in the middle of a genuine reorientation of their security thinking towards towards China, sorry, and the other parts have yet to fall in place. So there has been no change, to be honest.
And how this pivot, as some people would call it, I mean, actually it started under Obama, by the way, who strategically rebalanced the focus of the US in security and in many other fields towards East Asia. But what do we make of it as Europeans? What's the consequence for our relationship with Russia? I mean, again, I'm coming back to the same question. Some people say, well, that means we should kiss and make up with the Kremlin, and some people are saying that, well, we need more responsibility within the transatlantic alliance.
It hasn't been good so far, insofar as Macron's initiative, something which he, as a visionary, broadcast, was never ever consulted with East Europeans, the ones who actually border on Russia. The same thing was this out-of-the-blue idea of Merkel and Macron. Well, since Biden met with Putin, we should too. Again, never consulted with the countries most directly affected by Russia.
Anybody else wants to come in here? Okay, then let's move on to the building resilience. And if we can't improve relations, or if we can't achieve anything with the Kremlin as it is now, how do we improve our resilience? Daria, you already started on strategic corruption. Maybe a little bit more about what Europe has to do in this area.
Well, I will follow up with Biden, actually. What Biden did well, he at least admitted publicly that corruption is a threat to national security. And now all agencies within the Biden administration, how to prepare the exact plan, how to deliver, how to strengthen, what to change within the legal framework and political framework in the US government in order to address this threat. But I don't see anything like that within the EU. I see that the EU is focusing on disinformation. I see that there is a person within the European Commission in charge for the Green Deal, so climate is an issue, but I can't identify who within the European Commission is in charge of tackling corruption as a security threat. And it's usually, we are now talking at the security conference about corruption. It's usually a very unusual thing to do. It's usually an elephant in the room. But when we are talking about all hybrid threats towards democracy, somebody is paying for that. So we have to follow that money, and we have to find a way how to block access of this dirty money coming from autocracies, specifically from Russia, to the EU, UK, Switzerland, and the US. And what is even more important, we have to talk about how to block access for kleptocrats, oligarchs, their family members especially, to the EU member states, because they feel very good here. They have passports in Cyprus, elsewhere. So this has to be addressed. But first, there is a need to accept that corruption is a security threat.
Thomas, you want to say something?
Well,
very briefly.
I mean, as long as you can buy for $1 million a passport either in Malta or Cyprus, I mean, what do we expect from the European Union? These people become EU citizens. You just have to have $1 million. And who are the people who have $1 million? Not the people that we want.
Vladimir.
I'm really glad that we're talking about this issue, because corruption is a security issue, it is a democracy issue, it is a human rights issue. And you know, it's been said that the largest export from the Putin regime to the West is not oil or gas, it is corruption. And I fully share that sentiment, except of course that is a two-way street. And for someone to be able to export corruption, someone else somewhere needs to be willing to import it. And we have seen no shortage of those chancellors, foreign ministers, and other high-ranking Western leaders. President Ilvest spoke very eloquently about this in his speech last night. Schröderizacja. It made big news at what little remains of Russian independent media this morning, because we're not talking about this enough. We're not talking enough about Western accomplices. You know, every time I meet with parliamentarians or diplomats or NGOs when I go to Western countries, I often get the question of, you know, how can we in the West help you in Russia, you know, the opposition, civil society, and I always respond in the same way. We don't need help. This is, you know, that's a constant leitmotif of the Kremlin propaganda, that if you listen to it, which I certainly advise that you don't if you value your nervous system, but if you listen to it, you would constantly hear that people like myself and my colleagues in the opposition, that we always go to the West and we always ask for money or for support or for wherever else. You know, my wife often asks me, so where's all that money I keep hearing about? Obviously it's nonsense, it's nothing to do with realities. I don't need to tell anybody in this audience. The only thing we do actually ask, and it's only for us Russians to change our country. It cannot and it should not be any other way. The only thing we do actually ask of our friends and partners in the West is that you stay true to your own values, is that you do not enable and be complicit in the corruption and the human rights abuses that the Putin regime is doing in our country, because the way this regime operates is that you have people at the top and around them who have made a habit of stealing in Russia from the people of Russia and then coming and stashing away and hiding and investing that stolen money in the West. People who break the most basic norms of civilized democratic society in my country and then come to your countries and enjoy the benefits and the privileges of the very same democratic civilized society that it offers. And this double standard should stop, this enabling should stop, and this complicity should stop. I think there's not enough conversation in the West about Western complicity in Putin's kleptocracy and authoritarianism, and I'm deeply grateful that President Ilvest made this a hallmark of his speech last night.
Yeah, great. Let me stick with this complicity for a second, but before that, ask my audience to give me a signal if you want to make a contribution or ask a question. Well, I will now ask my panelists a question, but then later on you can let me know. Complicity. There is also, there are efforts inside the European Union to not only undermine the rule of law in some member states, but also keep the whole rule of law thing away from the neighborhood policy of the European Union. In the Western Balkans, actually, there's some pre-accession process, and in Eastern Europe, in the Eastern Partnership. There's a commissioner in Brussels, Oliver Verhey, who consistently, there was a story in Politico a couple of days ago about this, consistently takes out language about the rule of law and basic rights in the documents of the European Union dealing with a neighborhood.
That's the definition of complicity. That's exactly what we're talking about.
And it's more than corruption. That's important. Maybe,
yeah, but,
Daria.
I would like to say that the soft power of the EU in pushing for rule of law is tremendous. And in case of Ukraine, it was the EU which included into visa-free regime requirements towards Ukraine, very precise requirements to Ukrainian government to deliver in regards to rule of law, anti-corruption institutions, access to information, basic, human rights rules, and that really enabled civil society in Ukraine to push for these very challenging reforms, and we have delivered. So we have to understand that the soft power of the EU to push for rule of law is huge. However, we are a little bit, we don't like that the EU is going back and is not using this soft power as much as it could.
Michał, short, and then we go to the audience.
Yeah, very short. When I hear, such questions that are being asked to you, what can the EU do to help you? I could easily answer, dear EU, first help yourself. Because there's not a single EU. That's the problem that we are dealing with. We are mentioning the rule of law, obviously. That's our fundamental value. This is at the very basics of our joint community. If there are some members of the EU, and unfortunately Poland being one of them, mentioned today as those who are breaking this fundamental value, we cannot speak about one single and united union, European Union. So that's the problem. So that there are many unions inside the union, and nothing's changing for better now. Just let me say, last night the informal meeting, EU meeting in Slovenia, Charles Michel was trying to raise the issue of strategic autonomy. They were sitting, long after midnight, and they went nowhere with this discussion. They invented a new idea of the strategic compass, as you might have heard.
It's not that new.
It's not that new. It's just that suddenly instead of strategic autonomy, but it's not about the wording. It's about the some fundamental directions that the EU should really be driving to, and we do not have an agreement on that.
Zbigniew Pisarski, your turn. Would you someone give the man a microphone, or otherwise use this one? And I see there are two gentlemen already waiting. All right.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a question to Vladimir or other members of the panel. We are already planning and working on the next edition of the Warsaw Security Forum. And would you recommend us to invite representatives of Russian government to be speakers on the panel, or other representatives of the Vladimir Putin entourage?
Thank you very much. The next gentleman, please.
I'll answer you quickly. Do not do that. All you get is boilerplate nonsense that aggravates the audience with blatant lying. I mean, all you have to do is go to the Munich Security Conference and listen to Sergei Lavrov speak for 10 minutes, and everyone is just going nuts, and he doesn't allow questions. And someone else, and you will get either Kosachev or some other clown. Do not invite them. Invite people who speak for Russia.
And also, even if you do invite them, the likelihood is they will not come because of your format. These people can only survive on a monopoly. The only way they exist in Russia is because we have no real opposition in parliament. Everybody's been cleansed out. All the television networks are controlled by the state. The whole public space officially is controlled by the state. So they meet with no opposition. They meet with no challenge. They peddle their nonsense, which is very often just factually incorrect. I mean, everybody heard the story a couple of weeks ago, I guess a month ago now, at the beginning of the school year in September, when Vladimir Putin was opening up a school, and he tried to give a lecture on history, and then a second grader corrected him that he mixed up his wars. And it was such an embarrassment, but they're not used to this. But very often the professional level of these people is that school kids, second graders can correct them. And that's why they never allow any challenge, they never allow any questions, they never allow any discussion. So even if you do invite them, and obviously I would never presume that's completely up to the organizers, but if you do, I'd give you 90% that none of them are going to turn up because of the format. Or otherwise they'll demand that they'll just speak and go without questions, but of course you will not allow that.
Okay, question settled, right? Next question, please.
Jan Ahlefeld, chairman of the Association of German and Polish Parliamentary Staff. I've seen that at the sidelines of this meeting, there was a coordination meeting of party delegations taking place. I saw, let's say, the Russians and the Azeris forming a kind of blocking voting minority of 40% in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in the early 2000s. The human rights defenders were all solo players, and we lost the battle to some extent for ideological hegemony. In the Council of Europe, one of the key institutions for defending rule of law and democracy in Europe. Are we sure that we do a better job in kind of looking for the soft belly where we might be attacked and our values put into question these days?
Well, I fundamentally think it was a ridiculous idea to invite the Russians back into the Council of Europe. I mean, the people who go there are the worst, and the results are simply blocking progress. The only benefit I see is the court, which does award judgments to people who have suffered in Russia, but that's it.
Very quickly to this, to what President Ilvest has said, it's important to separate Russia's membership in the Council of Europe as a country and the voting rights of the so-called parliamentary delegations. Those are two separate issues. Russia's membership in the Council of Europe gives us, as Russian citizens, the last access to genuine justice. The closest place for me in Moscow to find justice, especially in politically irritating cases, is in Strasbourg at the European Court of Human Rights. So thank God for our membership in the Council of Europe. That's the last standing vestige of our brief period of democracy from the 90s. Russia was admitted in 1996. However, a totally different question is of whether or not to accept the credentials of the so-called parliamentary delegation in the Assembly. And I spent last week in Strasbourg I was there for the autumn session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe to talk about how our so-called elections went 2 weeks ago. And my main message there was that if we do not have free and fair elections, and we obviously don't, then there is no legitimate parliamentary delegation. And when these people turn up there in January to request the credentials, they should not be accepted, not because they represent Russia, but because they do not represent Russia, because it is an assembly of parliamentarians and not of imposters and usurpers.
Thank you. Next gentleman.
Thank you. Stephen Mckelvey, Kennesaw State University. In June of 2021, this past June, when President Biden met with President Putin, Russian military aircraft violated the airspace of Estonia, Lithuania, and Denmark on 4 separate occasions that same month. And I'm aware that many airspace violations are not reported, but when they are reported, and when we know it's happening the same month that the President of Russia is meeting with the President of the United States, what in the world should the West do to respond to provocations like that?
Quick answer: provocations, airspace violations.
You know, before the meeting, there were provocations in Ukrainian border as well. And I think this is the way how Vladimir Putin is, is raising the stakes, and he makes the problems, and then he slows down a little bit and kind of sending the message that it's possible to work with him. That's the way how he behaves. But actually, the Russian troops on the border with Ukraine, they continue to be there, and Russian troops continue to be in the occupied territories of Ukraine.
To quote Lenin, if you hit mush, keep pushing, and if you hit steel, pull back.
I mean,
those flights have not met steel.
Yeah, we should have that set in stone somewhere on this stage. Sir.
Thank you. Fredrik Löfqvist, Director, Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. The future of Russia's relations with the West clearly depends on Russia, but of course we can do things as well. And I think there are 2 schools out there. One say that we must hold Russia accountable to international norms and standards and principles. And the other one, and both what goes on inside Russia but also outside of Russia, because there is a connection between internal repression and external aggression. The other school says that we must foster dialogue and have increased communication. My question is, can we do both, or is there a trade-off if you want to foster dialogue and communication? Don't we have to tone down sort of the accountability? What should we do? Is it dialogue or accountability, or can we do both?
Thomas, that's for you, first of all, and then the others.
Well, we've seen where 30 years of dialogue have gotten us.
Yeah. I mean, don't you want to quote the bayonet thing again? Vladimir.
Well, I actually don't see a contradiction here. I think there's no problem with talking as long as you talk from a position of principle, as opposed to the quote that we've just heard. International accountability. What's very important is people often talk about how Putin violates international law by, for example, doing what he's doing against Ukraine. What's also very important to remember is that he's also violating international law by doing what he's doing inside of Russia. Because I just want to recall one of the fundamental framework documents of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, of which every single EU member is a participating state, that says that questions relating to human rights, rule of law, democracy, and fundamental freedoms do not constitute internal affairs of a state, but are subject to international obligations. To counter this, red herring coming from Mr. Lavrov's foreign ministry that do not meddle into our internal affairs. These are not internal affairs. This is a fundamentally settled principle. And as I always also like to remind people, this principle is contained in a document signed, of all places, in Moscow. It's called the OSCE Moscow document, signed on the 3rd of October 1991. Actually, I guess the 30th anniversary came this week. And so those accountability mechanisms that Frederick referred to, they exist within the OSCE, they exist within the Council of Europe. It is incumbent, I would argue, it's not just the right, but the responsibility of democratic nations who are alongside us in the Council of Europe and OSCE to act to enforce those mechanisms of accountability, because these mechanisms only work if other nations are willing to enforce them. So I don't see a contradiction. It's dialogue, yes, but a dialogue from the position of strength, principles, and steel, if you will, as opposed to what usually these Putin-Versteher mean by dialogue.
Yeah, no mush. Okay, Janusz.
Well, Janusz Onyszkiewicz, Euro-Atlantic Association. The first question relates to internet. After all, is that so that we can do nothing really to prevent Putin to censor internet, which happened so prominently during the elections? After all, the internet companies are in the West, so I think that we can do something, and probably we should do something. The second question is of more of different nature, because we heard already during the previous panel that situation in China, economic situation, could get worse. There could be problems sometime in future, maybe not in a very close future, but in more distant future. In the situation of some economic crisis, it's quite easy to imagine some sort of outburst of nationalistic feelings, which already are in China. And these nationalistic feelings could turn against Russia. So the alliance between Russia and China, which is so firm now, need not to be absolutely lasting. So what do you think is the chance that there will be, after all, some conflict between countries which today are allies, but let's not forget that Soviet Union was an ally of Germany, and it didn't last very long. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Yeah, Vladimir, go ahead.
Thank you so much for two very important questions. On the internet censorship question, well, that's actually the perfect illustration of what we began talking about earlier, Western complicity. It was two American tech companies, Google and Apple, that followed the orders of a Kremlin dictator and themselves voluntarily took down an opposition app leading up to the parliamentary elections.
Yes.
On the week before the election, and as soon as the Kremlin said take it down, they complied. And I really hope that there is a strong reaction and then there is a strong condemnation by Western legislators, Western civil societies against those Western companies who act as poodles to foreign dictators, because this is shameful. And this illustrates very well everything that we've been talking about here. And on the China question, there are several ways, many ways, countless ways in which Vladimir Putin's policies, Vladimir Putin's short-term actions in the interest of his own regime actually contradict and violate the long-term strategic interests of our country. And I think that this issue is among the top of that list. Russia is a European nation. Russia is a European power. And by artificially trying to cut us off from our natural civilizational family, in order to act as a junior partner to the communist dictatorship in Beijing, I think Vladimir Putin is committing yet another crime against the strategic long-term interests of our country. And just sort of a short amendment. You know, I think it's not right to talk about Russia and China as allies. It's right to talk about this relationship between Putin's dictatorship in Moscow and the communist dictatorship in Beijing. I don't think it's going to stand the test of history.
Okay,
I think
45 seconds for
just
each.
To add to that, I will simply say that this is an alliance of dictatorial regimes. Thinking you can change those dictatorships is altogether different from dealing on the ground. And I just read I read in the Times about, New York Times, about 6-7 months ago, about how on the Chinese side of the Russian border, there is a museum of Chinese-Russian friendship, which they do not allow Russians in because it's so Russophobic.
Okay, that should tell us a story. Daria, what's your final word? Just be selective.
Yeah, well,
The internet one.
my final word is that when we talk about West, we usually talk about EU, but from the Russian perspective, the West is also Ukraine, at least geographically. So it's, and Ukraine is in the position also to help by being successful in democratic transition. And, you know, yeah, a lot of Ukrainians are Russian-speaking. A lot of Ukrainians have good ties with average Russian people. And if we are successful, if we are changing the way of life and the standards of life of Ukrainian people, if we prove that democracy can succeed in Ukraine, that it is a motivation, I believe, also for Russia and Belarus to build that democracy. So that's our role as Ukraine.
Thomas.
There's a subtle shift that has not been noticed, but in the early Putin years, the line was that no country that was in the Soviet Union, because of our Soviet experience, could ever become democratic, so don't expect it of us. It has now shifted to Slavic, because the success of the Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians as former members of the Soviet Union makes that utter nonsense, so you can't really say it anymore. And now the push is toward the East Slav nations. That is why Russia so fears and hates Ukraine, because when Ukraine makes these steps towards democracy, it once again undermines the whole Putinist raison d'etre.
Michal.
This is the final word
This
already.
is the final word.
It's so quick. Come on. Look,
I need 2 minutes myself.
You have 2 minutes. All right. I understand. You know, our initial issue was the EU and what to do next in our relations with Russia. I would say, you know, when we're talking about the European defense, this discussion has to be intensified. We have no other choice with the pivot in America and Trump, Biden pivot towards Obama first, pivot towards China. We need to sit down and really seriously talk about our own defense. This would be much premature to start talking about the European army. We have a huge homework to do regarding the interoperability, regarding the cooperation between the national armed forces of the EU member states and the NATO itself. There are lots of things to be done before we start actually talking about the European army, but this discussion has to intensify because we need to be ready, much more ready than we are today.
Great. I see we just suddenly got magically some 5 more minutes. So
it's like electronic voting in the Russian election 2 weeks ago. It just bang, and the time appeared. Can we get 10 more?
I wonder who is behind this. But
who's there? Who's there behind the scene?
I mean, we might have, if I could get this thing to properly work, we might take questions from the virtual audience, but I don't see any. So, no, let me give you the takeaways. It's no problem if we finish 2 minutes early. Let me give you the takeaways of this. And I would be completely subjective by saying, well, first of all, obviously, the future of Russia's relations with the West is a future of sustained confrontation. This is not going to end very soon. And that's for democracy is always a problem. I mean, we all know that. It's a challenge. But I think the jury is still out. We still have a fighting chance. Now, the four steps to putting democracy at the heart of that relationship, because this is what how I would summarize our debate, to put democracy at the heart of the EU-Russia and Western Russian relationship. And that means global solidarity with democrats starts at home. It starts by defending our own democracy against strategic corruption, against hostile influence, against manipulation on social media, and so on. And second, it continues in the second step with solidarity with democrats in the neighborhood of the European Union. And that means governments, and it means also democratic movements in neighboring countries. Because simply, and this also transpired from our debate here, because a successful Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova is perceived by the Kremlin as an existential threat, because that demonstrates to Russians that, that they could have the same, and that they might, by taking to the streets and doing their own color revolution one day, they might actually have a Russian democracy as well. And the third step, of course, is then supporting democrats in Russia itself. Now, due to the crackdown, to the fact that Russia is becoming a totalitarian country as we speak, that has become very difficult when it concerns organizations and people in Russia itself, but it's still possible. But it all the more means supporting the people who have left Russia in recent years and are working now from abroad. Lithuania, for example, is the recently most important country in this respect, and of course other Western states. So supporting Russian democrats, and then the fourth one, visioning Russia as a democratic country. And actually, you know what? By the time power changes and Putin leaves the Kremlin in whatever physical shape, my prediction is it won't be in one piece. Bayonets, so by the moment power changes in Moscow, what I would define as the three criteria, some kind of separation of powers in Russia, acknowledging sovereignty for the neighbors of Russia, and stop attacking the West. Now, these three might not actually be enacted with the same speed and at the same time. And there will be a time when the West is deeply disunited, or might be deeply disunited, about how to exactly deal with the new people in power in Moscow. I think we'd better prepare for that moment right now by defining the criteria, and by imagining how to exactly engage and help a democratic and democratizing Russia, because the transition might also be bumpy and painful. And I see, Thomas, you have like 3 words now. No? Okay, good. So I want to
since we have 1 minute left, let me express our gratitude and our admiration for the organizers of this year's Warsaw Security Forum, Kasia Zbyszek, their team, Michał Baranowski, and the team. Really amazing job that you did. Amazing job, and let's join.
Very well. I mean,
just
yes?
3 words, if I may, to circle back to what we started this conversation with about countries that are able or not able to be a democracy. I'm a historian by education, and I like to look at wider periods than a week, a month, or even a year, or even a decade. And if you look at about 3.5 decades ago, which is by historical standards yesterday, if you look at the map of Europe 3.5 decades ago, half of Europe was living under dictatorial and totalitarian regimes, including all of our countries represented here, including half of yours, Roland. Today, you look at the map of Europe, there are only 2 dictatorships left. Those are Putin's Russia and Lukashenko's Belarus. So let's work together to make Europe dictator-free. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.